There we are. Well, hang on, let me do this. I think I've learned that I can do this. That's better. Just we can have terrestrial biomes. We can also have aquatic biomes. They also have a lot to do with the distribution of life on Earth, but in the oceans and rivers. So let's just get looking at those. So here's our list of aquatic biomes. I'm not going to read it to you because you know how to read, but you can see that there's a number of them that you're expected to know for this course. And let's just get on and look at what makes them different from terrestrial biomes to start with. So a terrestrial biome, basically, the limiting factors that really determine what can and cannot live and how productive a particular terrestrial biome is going to be, has to do with temperature and precipitation. How warm is it? And how much water is there? Well, obviously, in the oceans, the temperature doesn't change that much, and well, there's always water. Instead, what we find is the limiting factors tend to be the availability of sunlight, the amount of dissolved oxygen, and probably most importantly, the availability of nutrients. So let's start with freshwater. So, sorry, that was gross. I burped. Freshwater basically means water that contains less than 1% salt content. All water has some salt in it, but we don't notice the taste of it until we get to about 1%. So freshwater, water that's on land, is really a very small amount of the water on Earth. Let's just take a look at this. So here's all the water that's on Earth. You notice 97% of it is in the oceans, and that's salty. That leaves 3% of the water on Earth is not salty, has less than 1% salt content. Now, of that 3%, almost 80% of it is in the ice caps and the glaciers, primarily in the poles, and also in alpine mountain ranges. Then there's a groundwater. Water that is caught up inside the ground is a fairly large chunk of what's left. And that means we have about 1% of 3% is what's available at the surface, the kind of fresh water that you and I encounter in our day-to-day lives. Now, of that 1% of 3%, half of it essentially is found in lakes, but the other half isn't in rivers. It turns out that about almost 40% of it is just trapped in soil. 1% of it is inside living things, but about 8% of it is in rivers. So it's a very, very small fraction of a fraction of a fraction that's available in rivers and lakes. Now, here's what's important about them, though. So rivers and lakes play a very important part in terrestrial biomes as well, because many, many, many organisms that live on the surface of the earth are dependent on their water supply. Everything needs to drink. Plants need water in order to grow, and often rivers and lakes are what provide that. So we find is that a lot of our drinking water for species, the habitat, a big part of the terrestrial food web is reliant upon this aquatic biome found in rivers and lakes. Now let's just talk a little bit about rivers. So rivers typically start in highlands in the mountains, either from melting snow or from springs where groundwater comes to the surface. And in the mountains, it tends to flow very quickly. So what we notice is that the upper reaches of river biomes tend to be very different than the lower reaches. The upper reaches tend to be fast-moving, clear water. There are organisms living in it, but there's not that much in the way of nutrients, and it tends to just very quickly, in a very short amount of time, ends up in the lower reaches of the rivers. Now, when it gets to the lower reaches, we tend to notice that trees start to reach over the banks of it and drop their leaves into it, and that provides a lot of nutrients to the water. So what we find is, as we move from the upper reaches of the mountains down to the lower reaches of the slow-moving water closer to the sea level, there's a definite increase in the amount of available nutrients in river systems. So by the time we get to the lower reaches, it's tend to be a very nutrient-rich environment. Although, if you notice, they often tend to get a fairly dark color, and that means that there's not as much light available. So it's not as productive as it otherwise would be. Although there's a lot of nutrients, the productivity is not quite as high as it would otherwise be if the light could get into the water and provide for photosynthesis. But that's very different when you get to what's called a wetland. Now, wetlands are a super important aquatic biome. So when we say wetlands, we mean like swamps, bogs, marshes, These are places where there's ground that is covered with water for at least part of the year. A swamp might be all year, but it could also just be like a low-lying area of, say, grassy, meadowy area that through part of the year is covered with, the rainy part of the year is covered with water. Now, what's important here is that they tend to have a very high concentration of nutrients, and the water tends to be somewhat shallow, so it provides light penetrates it, and the productivity is quite rich. In fact, as high as a rainforest. It's very, very productive biome, and many species rely on this. A lot of insect species, a lot of fish species, and a lot of bird species. So we tend to find that these wetland areas are very important and are things we need to protect because people often want to drain them and build on them, and it's essentially the same thing as cutting down rainforests. It really disrupts a very important biome. Estuaries are another very important biome. So what happens is when a river system reaches the sea, it tends to slow down, and often you'll have like a beach area, or you might have what's called a barrier island that slows the flow. And so the nutrients that are coming down in here tend to mix with salt water. And when that happens, the mud content that often stops the light from penetrating, it flocculates, or it clumps together and settles down. So we tend to find that these areas here tend to be very, very high in nutrients. Basically, all the nutrients coming down the river end up in this estuary area. And so, again, the productivity tends to be as high as a rainforest. They're incredibly rich environments, and we find that there are many organisms, bird species, juvenile fish species. So a lot of the fish species that live in the open oceans through most of their lives will spend their juvenile time period just snacking up on all the great food that's available in an estuary. And they also provide a lot of food and shelter for many species, including bird species, and, as I said before, juvenile fish. Now, estuaries basically come in two flavors, if you will. So in temperate areas, we get what are called salt marshes. They kind of look like this. I basically grew up next to a salt marsh. And then when we get to more tropical places, we get mangrove swamps, which I absolutely adore. If you ever get a chance to go canoeing through them, it's wonderful. So both of them are places where a lot of sediment, and remember the sediment is going to be silt, it's going to be leafy debris. It has a lot of nutrients, so these plants tend to trap these nutrients and then grow explosively. So we find is that these two types of estuaries are very nutrient-rich environments that provide a lot of food for a lot of species. Now, salt marshes tend to form often behind barrier islands. You have this very warm, very shallow water. And there's not many plants, not many root plants that can grow there, but there's one type which is called Spartina grass. So pretty much anywhere you go in the world, if it's not tropical and full of mangroves, you'll often see this type of salt grass. It's called Spartina. And just like a prairie, it's an annual plant that grows and dies, and then its roots provide more nutrients as well. So these channels between these clumps of grass tend to be very uh, full of life and very productive areas. Now, mangroves are trees that are rooted trees, and they are especially adapted to reach down into the water, and they have a way of they have little nodules above the water where they can shed salt, and so these trees tend to grow in tropical estuary environments. And this root structure is very important. You can see, like, it's just this tangle roots. It's very well equipped for trapping sediment and capturing nutrients. Now, if you ever have a chance to go snorkeling in an environment like this, which I have, I got to tell you, it's pretty amazing because these roots provide incredible protection for fish. Larger fish just can't get in there. Smaller fish will stay there. So there's a lot of food. There's a lot of photosynthesis going on in here. So there's a very strong food chain happening here. And juvenile fish species of all different kinds of oceanic fish will take refuge in there. So it turns out that these mangroves are incredibly important for marine fisheries. Now, everybody loves a coral reef, myself included. Coral reefs tend to be found, it's a biome that's tend to be found a little bit offshore. Usually they're not near a river mouth. It has to be someplace where there's not a lot of sediment because corals, although they look like plants, they're actually little animals that secrete, most of them, a calcareous, a calcium carbonate skeleton. And so that's the hard part. And on that surface of that hard part are these little polyps, which they're kind of like little jellyfish that are anchored to a skeleton, and they filter out single-celled organisms from the ocean water, and they basically provide a lot of habitat. They're not photosynthetic themselves because they are animals. I mean, they look like plants, but they're actually animals. However, algae often grow among them as well. So even though the corals themselves are not producers, they don't capture sunlight and turn it into food energy. They provide a surface on which that can happen. I believe I just said all this to you here. So I'm just going to keep on going. But again, coral reefs are incredibly important because they provide, like mangroves, a lot of shelter for juvenile fish species. So the biodiversity in a coral reef obviously is something is over the top. Even though they are not themselves capturing lots of energy, they provide a lot of shelter for organisms. Now, the photic zone is a biome in the ocean. Basically, photo means light. So we're talking about the light zone. This is basically the upper couple hundred meters of the ocean where light can penetrate. Now, phytoplankton, which is basically plankton that is able to photosynthesize. So we're talking algae, little protists. These are organisms that float in the upper reaches of the ocean, and they form the basis of the food web there. And as long as they can grow, they need light. So that's one of the limiting factors that it's got to be clear water for that to happen. But the other thing is they need nutrients. And what we find is if we go too far offshore, if you get in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it's kind of dead. There's just not a lot of nutrients available. So although the photic zone is a very large part of the aquatic biome of the planet, much of it is dead because there aren't enough nutrients in order for these phytoplankton to grow. All organisms need to build their cells, and those cells need molecules. They need atoms. They need nitrogen. They need uh, carbon. They need phosphorus, and those things are not in very good supply out in the middle of that ocean biome. Now, when we get below the photic zone, we get what's called the aphotic zone, which basically means the no light zone. It's also called the abyssal zone. And basically, light can only penetrate so far. Well, if light can't penetrate, you really can't have any productivity. You can't capture light energy and turn it into food energy. So there's no photosynthesis taking place down there. So why would there be any life there at all? Well, there's light up above, and so things up above die and they bring nutrients and food down below. So the things that live down at the bottom, these organisms that live in the aphotic zone are reliant on the productivity that's happening above them in the photic zone. Now, one of the things that's interesting though is there's also a fairly limited supply of oxygen because most of the oxygen in the ocean comes through mixing at the surface. And when you get down deep, that oxygen doesn't penetrate down there. So that lack of oxygen makes it difficult for most species to survive down there. So a lot of the dead organisms from the surface that are falling down and carrying essentially food energy down to the bottom, they're not getting consumed. And so as they gradually deteriorate, the nutrients that were in them pile up. So what we find is that this deep water of the aphotic or abyssal zone tends to be very, very high in nutrients. And if those nutrients can be brought to the surface, as they are, say, off the coast of Peru, through a process called upwelling, which we'll study this year, then you have a lot of nutrients and you have a lot of light and you have a lot of oxygen, and then you get this explosive amount of life. Now, in this aphotic zone, there is an interesting life type of life down there. It's called vent life, and it is the only example on our planet of a food web that is not based on productivity of light energy. So it's not light energy that's being captured and turned into food. Instead, it's based on what's called chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. So there's chemicals that are coming out of these volcanic vents. There are bacteria that are able to to digest and release the energy from those chemicals, and they form the basis of the food web. Now, interestingly, the organisms that are living on these vents are very similar to ones that we find at the surface. They just over millions of years have evolved to move away from a photosynthetic basis of their ecosystem to a chemosynthetic one. And this is worth noting. So the oceans are vast; they cover a lot of our planet. However, uh, what we find is on terrestrial biomes, that's where actually most of the life on Earth, believe it or not, is actually pound for pound is found on the land. So plants account for 1,000 times the amount of living matter, we call it biomass, as animals. So on the ground, there's 1,000 times more mass of plants than there is of animals. But we find in marine biomes, animals are actually 30 times more of the mass than the plants. And this really has to do with the fact that aquatic plants tend to mostly be single cellular, and they live and they die very quickly. So they're constantly growing and dying. So there's not a lot of them. So it's not like trees on land. A tree will live for 500, 1,000 years, just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and only some of it gets eaten at a time. But these plants in the ocean, they tend to get eaten all at once. It's a single cell, so it just gets consumed. So what we find is that there's a lot more mass of animals in the ocean than there is mass of plants at any given point in time. Just to throw this out there because I think it's kind of interesting, the total biomass on Earth is estimated to be about 550 billion tons of living stuff. And of that, only about 10 billion of it is coming from the oceans. So, we tend to think that most of life is in the oceans. And don't get me wrong, the oceans are super important, especially if you love seafood like I do. But most of the mass of life on Earth is actually found in the oceans. I bet I went over 15 minutes again. I've got to get better at this. See you guys. How do I stop this? I gotta get better at this.